even if I had on my name tag, which is in a very safe place, but I just don't know where that safe place is, you wouldn't have been able to read it from here. So I'd like to welcome you to the second day of Nasi's conference, 2012 conference. And the first day was, I think, exceptional. It was energizing, it was informative, and it just gave us hope, I think, at the end of the day. And the dinner talk by Michael Hiltzik was particularly useful. It was on the New Deal, and he calls it in his book, New Deal, A Modern History, to give us a look back in a way that we probably have not had. Not most of us who remember the New Deal from history books, not very many of us being there personally, have a quite different view from what the history actually is. And I think it's particularly helpful, as Michael said last night, because it gives us a sense of how to look at the times we're currently in, which bear a lot of similarity in many ways to that period, particularly when it comes to social insurance. We start today with the focus on employment. At first blush, one might ask, why employment in a conference on social insurance? But as you will hear in the course of the morning, the nature of your employment shapes your access to and need for social insurance. We will begin with a keynote address and then go into a subsequent panel immediately after the question period. There will be no break, so when the question period ends after Larry's talk, we'll move right into the panel. And I'm going to very, very briefly introduce our keynote speaker, because Larry said that if I said anything nice about him, he'd be extra embarrassed. So here it is, just the facts, no embellishment. Larry is president of the Economic Policy Institute. He's been president since 2002, and he's been with EPI for over 20 years. During that time, he's written and commented extensively on a variety of employment and education topics, and I'm sure this morning he will set us off on the right note for looking at employment issues this morning. Larry?
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be asked to give a keynote in front of many of my peers and a crowd of very respected folks, and at a conference of Nasi, which is one of the great organizations that we can rely on. It is quite remarkable that more than 4 years into a recession, you can have a conference where you need to have a keynote about jobs. And I think that says pretty much everything you need to know about the state of our nation and its economic policy and the condition of the people in this situation. We're not in a good place. 8.5% unemployment is not in a place where we want to be. And I'm going to address a few different things. I'm going to just mention a few reasons why I think we're here, but that's not the purpose of my talk, but it might give grist for some of the questions. But then I want to describe the employment situation, briefly mention, because I think it's a no-brainer, that there's many things we could do to have it be otherwise, and then spend more time addressing some of the reasons why people say we need not do anything about jobs, why we can just tough it out. So the first thing, of course, it could have been far worse. I don't want to forget that. There have been things that have been done, everything from the stimulus, the auto bailouts, monetary policy could have been worse. We could be listening to Ron Paul. So things definitely could have been far worse, but they're not good. And I think when we think about that first and foremost, we should never forget how we got here. And I'll just say, from my point of view, it's a combination of various laissez-faire economic policies that preceded the financial crisis and helped cause it. There's been mistakes by the administration. There's been good things by the administration. There's been policy errors by the administration. And there's been errors in communications. There's been a political opposition, which is, I come at this as a nonpartisan, which means I'm going to shoot at both parties, okay? So just to state that. Doesn't mean you can't shoot. That is sort of mindless, non-intellectual, and totally just oppositionists say no for their own political purposes. We also have the academic defeat of Keynesian economics, which is important. We have a country where the forces on the left are exceptionally weak, labor, civil rights, community groups, and that those forces are what I would call ideologically incompetent to deal with economic issues, which is a problem. And we also have substantial forces that try to get us to focus only on deficits, which is an important part of the story of why we are where we are. And the last thing I'll mention is that business profitability is actually doing pretty great right now. Profits are 30% higher than they were before the recession. The share of capital income in the corporate sector is the highest it's been since World War II, which was a period when we actively suppressed wage growth. So the fact is that those from that sector may not be as interested in jobs policy as they may have been in other times, because we now have an economy when they do well, even when the economy isn't doing well. So where are we? 8.5% unemployment. This is, more than 4 years after the, well, I guess that number is actually 4 years from the start of the recession in December 2007. That is still substantially higher than what at the worst moments of the prior two recessions, although not as bad as the 1980s recession. We have underemployment. People are familiar with, if you include involuntary part-time workers and discouraged workers, you'd have an unemployment rate of 15, 16%, for minorities, 23% or so. And we have the unemployment spells being at historically long period of times. If you're unemployed, you've been unemployed much longer than in other recessions. These are just snapshots of a month. If you look at what happens over the course of a year, we have about 30% of the workforce will be unemployed or underemployed at some point during the year. And for minorities, that would be about 40%. Okay, so I think that's pretty, the argument I'm going to make here is that the way that I think somehow the political leadership sometimes looks at this and the talking heads is this: if you have 9% unemployment, that 91% of the people are okay. I'm here to say otherwise. So even when you have 9% unemployment, you would find in a poll that 43% of people will say that either they themselves or someone in their family was unemployed in the last year, 43%. Now, the recession doesn't just affect people in terms of unemployment. It also affects, they have lower wages, they have less fringe benefits, they lose hours of work, they lose health insurance coverage, benefits, et cetera. In polls, you will find that 38% of people will say that they or someone in their family lost wages, hours, benefits, or health insurance in the last year, 38%. So that's pretty substantial. Now, the income losses in the recession, incomes were $4,200 less in 2010 than in 2007. Obviously, in 2011, they were still substantially below 2007, probably even lower than in 2010. So in 2008, 9, and 10, the cumulative losses for the typical median working age household was $9,000. And it's pretty clear that it'll be another $9,000 to $15,000 before we get to full employment again. So this is a substantial loss for the typical family. The losses also include the fact that all the young people that are graduating are graduating in an environment that's going to leave their earnings scarred for their entire lifetime. They will have lower lifetime earnings. We know this from pretty substantial research. And we should also focus on the fact that young children in school, elementary school, are going to have much lower educational achievement on account of the recession. We know this because we know that what drives educational achievement is actually more what happens outside of the schools than in the schools. We know it's about poverty, parental stress, the income losses, the housing problems, the extra housing mobility, and as well as the cutback in school resources that are happening. The damage to educational achievement, in my view, will be far more than all of the positive reforms that people talk about could possibly provide as a counterweight. But we don't talk about that. Now, we're in a recovery. We've been in a technical recovery since June 2009. We've seen unemployment fall from 10.1% to the current 8.5%. That's the good news. The bad news is that the recovery so far is actually in unemployment. The fall in unemployment is almost entirely due to the shrinkage of the labor force, the fall in the labor force participation rate, which has actually happened the most among those people with a college degree and those people with some college. So it's not about some low-educated group abandoning the labor force. We're talking about the entire workforce. We have job growth at 200,000 a month, which is actually better than it's been at other times. But if we stick with that, it'll take 7-8 years to get back to full employment. Projections show that the unemployment rate today is likely to be what we have at the end of this year, or let's just say a random time, November 2012. As Mark Zandi says, it'll be 8.7%. Goldman Sachs says 9%. The blue chip says 8.6%. So, that's not happy news. Now, is there something we could do about it? I just think it's obvious that there's lots we could do about it. I'll just mention them because I think I have a sympathetic audience, so I'll just remind you that a robust safety net, unemployment insurance, and SNAP, and the kind of things we've done in the past, payments to the elderly and to veterans, stimulates demand and creates jobs. That we could have investments in highways and transit and schools and green energy. Third, we could have state relief. The state cutbacks exacerbate our problems. Half the benefits of providing relief to the states are in private sector jobs. I'll be glad to explain that. Four, we can do something we haven't done so far. We should have. We should have direct government jobs. It would actually have been, I think, politically more effective and being visible. It's actually the most cost effective. Fifth, we could have early retirement. We could have a special period of time when people are allowed to retire into Social Security early with Social Security reimbursed, help move people into retirement and create more jobs. Work sharing. We could also deal with our problems with China. That's number 7. Dealing forcefully with the exchange rate issue could create over 2 million jobs in the next 2 years, generate growth, and provide $850 billion of deficit reduction over the next 10 years. How's that? And has bipartisan support, by the way. It's an interesting story. You should ask me, why doesn't that happen? 8, we could have a jobs tax credit. And 9, we could easily, we should do something about the housing problems. And if we wanted to do this, we needed to do it deficit related in the first several years, but it could be paid for. EPI in fall 2009 recommended a substantial jobs program paid for by a financial transactions tax that took effect in 3 years and was permanent, and therefore actually over a 10-year window was deficit reducing. So why don't we do it? I'm going to deal with 6 arguments that suggest, that's out there why we don't do it. The first is that the stimulus didn't work, and there are many economists. There is every Republican politician says the stimulus produced 0 jobs. And if that's not an indictment of the intellectual state of our debate, I don't think anything is. Because after all, 40% of the stimulus was actually tax cuts of various kinds. So to believe that you can throw that much money into the economy and it creates zero jobs has yet to be explained, and et cetera. So what was the stimulus? First of all, it was the aid to the states. It was the safety net expenditures I've mentioned. It was public investments, and it was tax cuts to individuals and firms. Now, of course, there's lots of studies, CBO and elsewhere, that would say that it created 3.5 million jobs. And then when I went to a hearing, one of my favorite stories is I went to a hearing in front of Barney Frank's committee when he was the chair of it, and testified about the stimulus. And the minority lead person, Spencer Baucus, and all the Republicans actually kept on saying the stimulus created no jobs, but at the same time they kept on saying if we let the Bush tax cuts expire, it would crash the recovery. And so I was trying to figure out, which sounds like a Keynesian argument to me, but because if you have a supply-side argument, expanding supply at the time of a recession does not lower unemployment, right? So you have to increase demand. So I wrote it up to Spencer Baucus afterwards, because in these settings you don't actually ever get a dialogue, even when you try and be obnoxious, which sometimes I do. And I said, tell me, why is it that if you put $1 in an unemployed worker's pocket, it creates no jobs, but if you take $1 out of a rich person's pocket, it crashes the economy? And anyway, there was no answer, and his staff pulled him away. So let's just understand, the simple facts are, if you just look at the economic trends, you will see that the GDP fell. I mean, the economy itself shrank by about 4% in less than 6 months, leading up to when the stimulus took effect. It was declining at a roughly 8% rate, okay? And so it took effect basically March, April 2009. By June of 2009, GDP was actually growing. Now, you have to have an explanation for that doesn't rely on stimulus to believe that stimulus had no effect. If you look at the employment declines, they were quite amazing. We lost 5 million jobs in the 6 months prior to April 2009. And after the stimulus started happening, and the early parts of it were actually state relief and some checks to veterans and people on Social Security, employment declines rapidly decelerated, and it took a year to get actual employment growth. So it's hard for me to accept the arguments that stimulus had no effect. Okay, what about deficits? We can't do anything because there were large deficits. And this is something that an argument that was used within the administration about why not doing more after the stimulus. I've talked to some leading Democratic economists outside of the administration who told me we just can't do any more. We're just going to have to tough it out. So this is somewhat bipartisan. But of course, the Republicans who never met a deficit they didn't like under George Bush all of a sudden said that deficits in the middle of the deepest recession since the 1930s were all caused by Obama's policies and spending. The reality is that in fiscal year 2007, the deficit was just 1.2% of GDP. We could have wanted it to be plus 3%, but it was 1.2%. It became, in just 2 years, 10% of GDP. Now, do you think that there were policies that were implemented that did that? The answer was no. All of the deficit, most of the deficit increase is because you have high unemployment, people are not paying taxes, you have a temporary increase in spending from automatic stabilizers, there's more Medicaid, there's more food stamps, unemployment insurance, all things that go away when unemployment goes down. and you had temporary measures to deal with the recession. So, that being the case, it's impossible to balance the budget or to get deficit in where you want it to be at 8, 9, 10% unemployment, or frankly, even 7%, perhaps even 6% unemployment. So it seems to me to get responsible, get your place where you get you where you want to be, you have to actually create jobs. And when you spend money for jobs, you actually get about 35 to 40% of it back in higher revenues and lower spending. So it comes with a roughly 40% discount. And that's why in February 2010, David Walker, then the president of the Peterson Foundation, I wrote an op-ed that said the first priority, if you care about deficits, the first priority is create jobs. The deficit problem is a long-term structural problem, not about the immediate. Okay, a third argument is it's really about we're not getting jobs because of uncertainty about taxes and regulation. You don't hear that as much right now as you did a few months ago, and that's because finally there became a debate about it. But if you look for anybody making that argument, you will not find an economics paper that actually lays out why this is the case. You just get an appeal to common sense. But if you look at what employers do and what they say, it's clearly not the case. What they do, private sector employment has actually grown more in this recovery than in George Bush's recovery. Private sector investment in equipment and software, stronger in this recovery than in George Bush's recovery. There's lots of, so what employers are actually doing does not fit the story that they are really worried about regulation and uncertainty about taxes relative to other times. And when you ask in surveys, businesses also say their leading problem is poor sales. They also report that they're worried about taxes and regulation. And you might not be surprised to learn that they always complain about taxes and regulation. And they complained about taxes and regulation as much under Clinton, when there's a robust recovery, or even under George Bush, the daddy, or late Ronald Reagan as under Obama. So they always complain about that, and you can always find an employer to put on your news show to complain about that. Okay, two more. Structural unemployment and unemployment insurance, then I'll stop. Structural unemployment is the concern that the unemployment we see out there is really because there's a mismatch between the skills of the workers and the jobs that are out there. Now, this is an argument that's always out there, even in the best of times, and I think actually is not so much true even in the best of times. But at this moment, it is utterly ridiculous. That's the term I learned in graduate school for such an argument. Okay. We have more than 4 unemployed for every job opening. Even if every unemployed person took the available jobs, 3/4 of them would still be unemployed. It can't possibly be the case that it's a mismatch. Job openings are still 27% below what they were before the recession. This is true in every industry and sector. It's not just one sector. It is every sector. People talk about construction as if that created our problem. And this is one of my complaints in life, is that macroeconomists don't seem to understand BLS.gov. That's the BLS website where you can actually get data. And that is, if you look at the number of construction workers who are unemployed relative to total unemployed, it's actually lower in 2011 than it was in 2007. That means it can't possibly be construction unemployment fueling the unemployment. It is true construction lost a ton of jobs, but those workers apparently have either found work in other sectors, left the labor force, or left the country. And I think all 3 of those things happened. And it can't possibly be, just think about it, how can it be in 3 or 4 years that we transformed our workplace such that all these millions of people that were employed and useful now are not, when we haven't had a surge of productivity growth? It belies common sense, and it also belies common sense that we have unemployment among college graduates that is more than double what it was before the recession. It's lower than the average unemployment rate. It's 5.2% BLS doesn't report the unemployment rate, by the way, for college grads, just college grads and those with advanced degrees together. And if you look at young college grads, where's Catherine Edwards? Her work tracking this. Young college grads, white young college grads, unemployment rate 9%. Black, 15%. Hispanic, 14%. And last, I'm out of time, just 40 seconds. Unemployment insurance, which people here deal with. We do have, the most extensive system of UI benefits that we've ever had. And God bless the policy for that lifeline for those people in certain states, 99 weeks. You have some people like Senator Hatch saying that these people are on vacation, it's time to get back to work. Just cut back, and it's unbelievable, and I really hope that someone runs TV ads with these people saying that. Now, if you actually look at the evidence from the Heldrich Center at Rutgers about how the unemployed are responding to their situation, you will see people going bankrupt, people are selling their houses and moving in with their family. They are shrinking moving to smaller places. They are not going to doctors. They are doing a lot of things that don't seem to reflect their being on vacation. Now, if that doesn't work for you, the best research by a former EPI staffer, but now a professor at Berkeley, Jesse Rothstein, showed that all the problems with, people have unemployment benefits and therefore maybe they don't get jobs as quickly could lead you to estimate that unemployment was about 0.3% higher in late 2010 than it otherwise would be. That means out of a 4.4 percentage point rise, maybe 0.3% was due to UI because of that. Now, counter to that, half of that rise of 0.3 is because some people are still in the labor force looking rather than dropping out, which doesn't really mean they would have been employed. And it doesn't take into account two other things. One is that if not everybody that's unemployed is on UI. If the UI person is not taking a job, who's to say that someone that's not on UI didn't take that job? And last, I think the biggest reason is there's an actual macroeconomic benefit to unemployment insurance. We put expenditure into the economy, people spend. That alone in 2010 lowered unemployment by 0.4%. So that's actually a bigger effect than this sort of malfeasance of incentive, so to speak. The only other example that people give is that people are stuck in housing because of the foreclosure problem. And the fact is that Hank Farber from Rutgers, Princeton, has done research recently and showed that there's bigger housing lock for renters than homeowners. So that can't be the case either. So in the end, I think we have a lot of excuses for inaction. The unemployment we have, the jobs crisis we have, is damaging our nation. It's damaging our future. It is totally unacceptable, and we shouldn't accept it. Thank you.
We are a little short on time, but I think we can take a couple of questions. If you want to go to the mics on one side, and if you're unable to get to a mic, there's someone in the back with a roving mic, so raise your hand. She'll get to you, and I'll try to recognize you in turn. While we're waiting for people, I have one or two questions. I'll ask the most social insurance related one first. You talked about in your list of what we could do, you mentioned Social Security providing some incentives for early retirement. And I'd like you to elaborate on that, especially in light of the fact that the data show that there are more older workers out there trying to get jobs, presumably because their 401k or 403b or whatever has kind of disappeared, or at least gone down sufficiently that they don't think they can have a comfortable retirement. Well,
I think it's definitely true that the increase in labor force participation among, I hate to say older workers because I'm in that group now, is, because I'm no longer prime age, is...
That doesn't sound any better, Larry.
Yeah. And I'm a grandpa. It's true that, although it's hard to really know, but, the loss of health insurance and the loss of in the financial crisis keeps people employed. I don't think that means that there aren't people that would retire early, and I'm not saying this solves it, but I like it for two reasons. One, I think that there are a lot of people out there that are going to have a really tough time finding jobs, and that are older workers. I think if we do something that provides them a lifeline, that the budget makes sure that Social Security is whole. I'm not trying to weaken the Social Security financing. That I think it's a good thing to have a temporary early retirement period. I also like it because I think it militates against the whole notion that we keep on hearing about raising the retirement age. I'd like to have a temporary lowering of the retirement age. And
so would you then, at this lower age, provide, in quotes, full benefits? That is, as if you... No.
I think what I would do first, if I were running policy at the White House for this, I'd ask Nasi for a group of experts to design the appropriate way to do it.
Right answer. One other one is you talk about the mistakes or errors with messaging, and this has come up this morning in at least one of the workshop panels about how to message to get people to understand and support social insurance. Given it's an election year, you're going to have need soundbite messages. What are maybe 2 or 3 messages that you would want us to go forth with, or somebody to go forth with, to kind of help people understand the situation that you've described today, as opposed to the myths that we seem to believe, or some people do?
Yeah. Well, what I said was errors in policy and communications, and I think the error in communications was that essentially from late 2009 until the president announced the American Jobs Act, he highlighted the problems of deficits, which overshadowed and helped take the issue of jobs, at least the idea that he was concerned about jobs, off the table. I think he did that by creating the Bowles-Simpson Commission, and maybe that was to try to satisfy certain people, that he wanted to salute the idea of a long-term deficit problem. But what happened was that the administration was AWOL in terms of their public face about jobs, and whether or not they actually were AWOL, they were just sort of limited participants in doing things about jobs in that period of time. The other communications error is just broadly among those who favored the stimulus, is that they didn't know how to talk about all these different components of the stimulus and how they lead to jobs. And we can see this in either the refrain from doing that or in the practice of how they are arguing for the payroll tax holiday. It is, how to be polite? Be polite. The idea of arguing for that as you don't want to raise taxes on the middle class, rather than we need to put some money into people's pockets to spend and create jobs, is opportunistic, digs themselves into a hole. It reduces politics to my tax cuts versus your tax cuts, which is a battle I don't want to win and a war I don't want to wage. And so if I had to say there's communications problems, there's the fact that they abandoned the field. They didn't know how to talk about the effect of stimulus. They stopped talking about it, and when they talked about it, wrongly, or stopped talking about it.
Okay, we have a question here at the mic.
Hi, my name's Alex, and I'm a freshman at Harvard. And I was wondering if you could spend a little bit more time talking about the number of high-quality and high-paying jobs that are out there that employers can't fill because there's not enough people in the workforce with the proper qualifications.
Yeah, I hear that a lot, but of course there's, it's hard for me to get evidence of that. And some of that you hear from the manufacturing sector, and I can understand that. And I guess I have to put on my hat as someone who's been concerned about the manufacturing sector for 3 decades and wondering how can these manufacturing firms complain that people coming out of high school don't seek to make manufacturing their lifelong career? Who would do that? I mean, it's not rational to say to a sector that has been degraded and outsourced and is provides very little security for the future. Why would you, at age 18, throw your life to I want to be a semi-skilled or a skilled manufacturing worker, and especially given that the lowering of pay in those fields. I would say that if you read the last Sunday's article in the New York Times that most people have read about Apple and China jobs, that it affirms to me what's true is that employers always complain. Sar Levitan, anyone remember Sar Levitan? Sar Levitan was one of the great labor economists, DC-based labor economists of the post-war era. He told me employers always complain about skill shortages. And what that means is that if they hang out a shingle and they don't get a long line of people wanting to work at whatever they feel like offering, there's a shortage. And that is exactly what's going on right now. And it's even worse because they want the workers given to them immediately at government subsidy, at the lowest wage possible, whenever they want it at midnight or 3 a.m. And so I'm all for education and training to deal with that. We needed more education and training every year that I can remember. But that is not why we have high unemployment, in my view.
One last question.
Hi, Larry Seidman, University of Delaware. I think you're exactly right that the stimulus worked. The problem is it was too small. My question is this. We needed 60 votes in the Senate, and to get the 60 votes for the stimulus and for all kinds of other things, but for the stimulus, to get certain senators, they wanted the stimulus package lower, and to get them, the administration agreed to that. Now, here's my question to you, but to anyone else who can explain this to me. Why didn't those supporting the stimulus or other measures, why don't they make the other side do a visible filibuster that the public can see is what's holding up the works? Why do we sort of quietly allow an invisible filibuster and then have to compromise everything down, and then later on we have the consequences of not getting something through in the manner that would have been effective?
Okay.
I don't have an answer for that because I'm not an expert in Senate procedure, but various people have told me it's not as easy as it used to be. But I also don't want to let the administration off the hook for that because I also know that there's instances where in the spring of 2010, when the appropriations bill was being compiled in the Senate, and there was the issue of whether we ought to provide more state aid, that if the president had just come out for it and told the Senate Appropriations Committee that he wanted a big number in there, that he would have done it, and that vote would have been 50 votes, 51 votes, not 60. So there's acts of omission and commission here, and this is my nonpartisanship. The fact that you need 60 votes to get anything done is a travesty of democracy. But that doesn't mean that those are the only people that have inhibited action.
Okay, we have one last question from one of our scholarships attendees. A quick,
yeah, just very
short
quick,
question.
because you raised the Apple Foxconn New York Times article. You and Dean have been raising the point about the Chinese exchange rate manipulation. But wouldn't you think, after reading that article, that is just a plain human rights issue? Like the fact that these Chinese workers are basically are silently exploited. And how can you compete against that? That's happening because the Chinese system
Okay,
is just...
all right, okay.
No, I hear you. I hear you. So,
Quick answer, and
Okay.
the next panel, if you could sort of gather yourself together to come up here.
I'm for ending worker exploitation as well as for having better exchange rate policy. But I also think, I mean, this is, it's not true that just having low wages is enough. I mean, there are advantages the United States has that help offset low wages. And it really helps to have a 30-40% discount because of the exchange rate. If they didn't have that discount, there'd be a lot more things we could do here, even at the wages we have.
Okay. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you very much.